Hey everyone, it's Eric Hughey, host of the GenWhy Leaders Podcast, where we prepare millennials to be leaders of the future. Now, if you're familiar with the podcast, you know that it's usually interview-based, and we tell the success stories of high-performing millennials. Each time, I tend to ask a couple of the same questions. Not all the same questions, because that would be a boring podcast, but there are a key 1 to 2 questions that I ask every guest on the show. And one of those is, what books or resources have made a positive impact in your life or in your business? Books are such incredible resources because they take years upon years of people's successes and failures and condense them into a few hours of reading. The mission of the book breakdown is to take those few hours of reading and then further condense them into 15 minutes or less of listening. This is the GenWhy Leaders Podcast Book Breakdown. Hello all, it's Eric Hughey, host of the GenWhy Leaders Podcast, bringing you another book breakdown. Today's book breakdown is Path to Impact, a book by Wendy Merrill. This book epitomizes the mission of the GenWhy Leaders Podcast. As millennials, we are not so much focused on success itself, but significance. This means we want to spend time with our families and give back to our communities and have autonomy in everyday life. This book is great for any young professional with high career aspirations and big dreams. It also has practical advice, business stories, and workbook exercises to put you on the path to impact. Wendy Merrill is the founder of Strategy Horse Consulting Group, which provides customized group workshops, individual coaching, strategic planning sessions, and retreat facilitation designed to develop growth-oriented leadership. So let's dive into the book a little more. I think 3 chapters, the book as a whole are great, but 3 stood out to me. That is Chapter 3, Value, Chapter 4, Self-Advocacy, and Chapter 7, Risk. Chapter 3, Value. The transfer of value occurs in every relationship, whether it be business or personal. And so you need to be able to appraise and convey different kinds of value, but most importantly, your own value. And it's important to remember that these are not just adjectives, but they are true statements of experience that you've had in your life or in your career that will foreshadow future success. So you're not just kind or smart or humorous or whatever. You are a practitioner of finance, or you're a branding professional who has rebranded the last 3 organizations you've been with, who has seen double-digit sales growth after you have rebranded. Something concrete and evidence-based, not just adjectives. It's also important to avoid Impostor Syndrome. Ironically, we just talked about this on the last episode with Vineet Prasad over at Savings Academy. So if you haven't had a chance to go listen to that, be sure to check it out. At a high level, imposter syndrome is the unbelief in yourself. It is not having confidence. It's being an imposter to what people think you are. Many people may view you as a skilled, a very intelligent person, but sometimes, especially in very competitive work environments, you may not view yourself as that person. So instead, you want to be confident, know your own value, and remember that confidence is not arrogance. When you're pricing or valuing your services or your products, for that matter, be sure to base them on your true value. This ties back into knowing your value and what you can provide. What the market is doing isn't not necessarily what you can do. Maybe you're not as advanced, or maybe you think you are leaps and bounds ahead of what other people are doing in the market. So in that case, you shouldn't pay attention to what anyone else is doing or the price that they're offering at. You should base your services on that value that you perceive. And effective leadership, it's usually built on reducing stress or saving or making the company money. So a lot of the value you provide to your organization or to your own business usually ties back to one of those things: reducing stress or saving or making money. And reducing stress, I think, has the cultural component. People want to work there and stay there. Saving or making money is kind of that financial growth, right? All companies need money to survive and continue making money more and more each year to continue growing and providing more jobs and more growth as a business. Chapter 4 is self-advocacy. I think it's really important to be intentional. If you haven't had a chance, go back and listen to Ryan Bennett's episode, who was, I believe, episode 3 on this podcast. We talk a lot about self-awareness and advocating for yourself on that episode as well. But just knowing and understanding, defining yourself as a person, again, this ties back into value as well, but really your personal brand. And a personal brand should focus on two things, and possibly a third. One, thought leadership, which means you're essentially an expert on a specific topic. Two, a center of impact. Now, this center of impact is more than just being a networker or someone who slings business cards or LinkedIn connections. Being impactful is being more thoughtful when you're making introductions between people in your network. It's more strategic. You're really aligning people who have similar missions and values, and from that, your impact will be greater. If you're doing it out of selfish gain and just trying to connect with every single person you see on LinkedIn, that is not going to be very impactful because you are inward focused and not outward focused. Chapter 7 is risk. Now, being a leader or championing a cause that you believe in really opens the door to be ridiculed and judged by others. Really what this means is that you just have to get over the fear of what others think about you. And ultimately, when you think you're making moves and you feel like you are, sometimes the outward world doesn't really perceive it as that. I know for me, I'm very proud of where I've come in the podcast, but other people think, what the heck are you doing, Eric? What is this thing? Like, what do you got going on here? But it'll probably be, months or years down the road when they're finally catching on to like, oh, okay, I get the concept. I think back to, the stat or phrase that people say that, you have to repeat something 8 times before somebody hears it. So hopefully after many repetitions, people will start catching on to what you're doing. But regardless, it shouldn't matter. Keep your blinders on. Just keep rolling, keep grinding, and working hard on your business or your end goal. A common phrase in the business world, especially on the sales side of the business, is ABC, which primarily means always be closing. But Wendy takes a different stance on ABC in her book and says always be curious. So she says here, once we lose the ability to learn, we begin to manipulate others instead of inspiring them, which I thought was a really cool point. Always be learning, always be curious about how things work, how things could be improved. So the important key takeaway for me from this chapter was knowing and understanding your relationship with risk. Most people think they are being risky by avoiding a certain action, but most of the time we are being risky in our business or personal life because we are already doing some type of risky action that furthermore we need to stop doing. So Wendy highlights multiple risks to avoid in the chapter, but 3 stood out to me. The first being risk of work-life balance. In reality, people talk about balance, but ultimately there is no such thing as work-life balance, only work-life choices at any given moment. So work hard and stay focused at work, but then when you're home, be intentional with your time at home. Stay focused, don't answer your phone, things like that. Second point of risk to avoid in this chapter is risk of too much yes. I definitely am guilty of this. I think in every position I've ever held at some point I've done the equivalent of 2 desks full of work just to cover the base, so to speak. But in reality, I should have been saying no way more often because it would have saved me a lot of stress and heartache because ultimately the other person's workload wasn't my responsibility, and it was my responsibility as the employee I was hired to be for a certain role to stay focused on said role and that work. So that point really ties back in all this as far as knowing your value and self-advocacy. So definitely a important risk to avoid. The third risk to avoid that I thought was key was the risk of not taking ownership. So when you're managing multiple people, it's easy to point fingers when things go wrong, but ultimately everything points back to you and is very telling of whether or not you're an effective leader. So don't always look to shed responsibility, instead take ownership. Again, the book was great as a whole, but the 3 chapters that stood out to me were value, self-advocacy, and risk, or in this case, avoiding risk. So go check out Wendy Merrill's book, A Path to Impact, The Rising Leader's Guide to Growing Smart on Amazon, or learn more at strategyhorse.com.